Welcome back to the PhoneGap Essentials course on NetTuts Plus Premium. In this lesson we're going to be looking at PhoneGap's File API. Dealing with the File API can be a bit complex and can be overwhelming at first. All of the different mobile operating systems deal with file management in different ways, but PhoneGap manages to give us a single common interface for all of them. The API is based on the W3C File API and is our one interface to read, write, and navigate the file system of the user's device. As you can see, there are many different objects when dealing with the File System API. So I'm going to take you through it step by step, starting from the beginning. We'll usually be starting with the File System object. The File System object contains a name and the root. This is the root directory of the file system. We retrieve our file system object through the window .requestFileSystem. Then we request which type it is, a local file system .persistent, and we need an onSuccess and onError function call. In the onSuccess callback, we'll have our file system object, and from this we can get our root directory. The root directory of our file system will be in the form of a directory entry object. As far as PhoneGap is concerned, a directory entry is just a fancy name for directory. It contains some Boolean values so you can identify if it's a file or a directory, a name, and a full path. This is very important when we want to save or read files from the file system. As you can see, our directory entry object has many different methods we can use for searching through directories, getting files, copying and moving files, and reading metadata. Let's have a look at the getFile method. GetFile is used not only for looking up a file, but also for creating new files. When you use getFile, you'll be returned with a file entry object, which once again is PhoneGap's name for the actual files. From a file entry object, we can move the file, copy the file, remove the file, or we can create a file writer, which will allow us to write new information to the file, or we can use the file method, which will return a file object. The file object is different from a file entry in that it only contains information on the file in the current state. Once we have this object, we can read the file. And here's our file reader object. With a file reader, we can take the file object we just got from our file entry, and we can finally read it. We can read it out as a data URL or as plain text. The file reader also has a lot of handy functions for tracking the progress of reading, loading, or aborting a file read. When we successfully read a file, we'll get our result in the event attached to the target in a result object. This will contain the actual information from the file. We also have a file writer. This can be used to write new information or overwrite information contained within a file, and also file transfer. File transfer is very handy as it allows us to upload and download files to a server. The upload returns with info on the number of bytes sent so you can be sure it worked. And a download returns a file entry object. A few lessons back, we specifically imported jQuery just so we could use Ajax. With this, we wouldn't have to have. The transfer allows for some very complex behavior. When you do a file upload, in the headers you can pass authentication information. And finally, there's metadata. Every directory entry or file entry object will have metadata attached. A helpful property of the metadata object is modification time. This will tell us the last time the file or directory was modified. This could be very helpful if we wanted to create a synchronization engine where we were downloading files, images, and videos from a server, but only wanted to download the ones that needed to be updated. So let's have a look at an example. Open up Eclipse or Xcode and open up your index.js file. So the first thing we need to do is retrieve a reference to our file system. We do that with the window.requestFileSystem method. We're going to request the local persistent file system, and we're going to pass in two callback functions: getFileSystem or a general fail message. We're going to be using a general fail callback, and we'll use this for all of our failure callbacks. This is because dealing with the file system requires a lot of methods that use callbacks to execute code. Most of the time, all we want to do is print out a failure code to our console. On success, we're going to call our getFileSystem function. This will be passed a file system object. We'll do a log of the file system name and of the file system root name. Let's test that in the emulator. So in Eclipse, I've just run our code, and while you can see nothing in our actual application, if we look at the log, we'll see it fired the ready event, then it wrote persistent and SD card. Persistent is the name of the file system, and SD card is the name of our root. Now that we know that that's working, we can delete the two log lines and create an empty file. In this tutorial, I want to show you how to download a file from a server and save it to the device. But before we do that, we need to create an empty file to write our downloaded file into. So we're going to refer to the file system root, which, as you remember, is a directory entry object, and we're going to call the getFile method. We're going to enter in a file name. This will be the name of our file on the file system, and we're going to pass in two options. Create is true. Exclusive is another option, which basically states that if we try to create a file that already exists, the function will return with an error. And then we have our createSuccess callback and our general fail callback. So here is our createSuccess function. It will be passed the file entry of the file that we've just created, data.txt. So let's set up our file transfer. We're going to create a new variable, new file transfer. We're going to need to tell our file transfer from where we want to download our file. And this URL has to be encoded as a URI. I'm going to be downloading a text file that I've put on greenjdigital.com/data.txt. So let's start our download with the download method of the file transfer object. First, we need to pass in our URI. That's the location of our data.txt file. Now we need to pass in a location of where on our device we want to download this file to. That will be our file entry, the new file we've just created, using its full path. Next we need two callback methods, a success method and an error method. On success, we're simply going to announce our success on the test zone div and print out the full path of our newly created file. On error, we're going to get as much information as we can printed out to the log, the error source, the error target, and the error code. So let's see how that goes when we export it to the emulator. As you can see, it was a success. Download complete, and our new file will be located at file mnt sd card/data.txt. This lesson would hardly be complete, however, without showing you how to read back that file. Let's start by commenting out this line here, the line in which we created a new data.txt file. And instead, we're going to just get the file. Getting a file from a directory entry object is very similar to creating one. We just don't pass in this option here, which says create true. So we've still got our general fail function, but we're going to need to define a getFileSuccess function. Our getFileSuccess function is being passed the file entry object of data.txt. But remember, we can't work on a file entry object. We have to get back the actual file object. Using the file method, we create two callbacks, and the callback gotFile will be passed that file object. So here's our gotFile function. Finally, we have access to the file object, and we can create our reader. You may remember that a file reader is just an object with a lot of different methods and properties. One of the methods was onLoadEnd, which is called at the completion of loading up a file. We can define this method, and it will be called and executed when our file is completely read. So onLoadEnd, we're going to write something to our test zone div. This is the read text data, and we're going to print out the event.target.result. This is the actual data that has been read from the file. Now that we've defined our completion event, all that's left is to actually read the file. The file reader has two different methods for reading files: read as text or read as data URL. Read as data URL will encode your information in base 64. This can be useful for sending images across the web. So let's execute this code and see how it turned out. Back in Eclipse, I'll run the code, and we can see that it has successfully read the data to the test zone div. Here is the important data. We can cross-check this with the actual URL just to be sure. And there you see it. So we've successfully navigated our file system. We've downloaded a file from the web and saved it to the device. And we've read that file back. This simple functionality is absolutely integral for creating any type of complex application. In this way, you can create applications that get live data but can still be read offline. Check back in for the next lesson, where we'll be looking at the Media API. Ciao!